Before we begin, take a moment to note where you are listening from, not as a gesture of participation, but as a form of record-keeping. Over the years, I have learned that these stories surface in patterns, and patterns only become visible when distance and context are preserved. I first encountered references to the institution at the center of this investigation while reviewing a series of routine municipal ledgers from the early 1890s, documents concerned primarily with property transfers, maintenance expenditures, and the quiet administrative functions that rarely attract attention beyond their moment of use. At the time, I was researching a separate matter involving county relief expenditures, and nothing in my initial search suggested I would encounter anything outside the ordinary scope of public welfare record-keeping. The building appeared under a neutral classification, its name listed among other charitable facilities operating during that period, its purpose described in language that reflected the era's confidence in institutional care. The dates were precise, the funding sources clearly documented, the oversight committees dutifully recorded. What distinguished this case was not what was written, but what followed the final entry. The institution ceased operations in the year 1891. That fact alone would not merit investigation. Facilities close for many reasons, particularly during periods of economic strain or administrative restructuring. What unsettled me was the absence of any corresponding documentation regarding the individuals housed within it. The records accounted meticulously for supplies, staffing, and maintenance through the final weeks of operation, yet nowhere did they record the transfer, release, or reassignment of the children under the institution's care. There were no receiving institutions listed, no transportation invoices, no guardian notifications, no burial entries, no discharge summaries. The building was closed, the accounts were settled, the children were never mentioned again. To understand how such an omission could occur, it is necessary to establish the broader context of institutional care during that period. Orphan houses, in the late 19th century, operated under a hybrid system of public oversight and private management, often funded through a combination of charitable donations and municipal appropriations. They were expected to keep detailed records, not only for financial accountability but because the movement of children between institutions, households, and apprenticeships was regulated with increasing rigor during that era. Paperwork was not optional. Children were enumerated, assigned, inspected, and reassigned with bureaucratic consistency. That consistency is what makes the silence in this case so conspicuous. The building itself was constructed in the early 1870s, situated on the outskirts of a growing industrial town, close enough to receive supplies and oversight, far enough to maintain separation from residential districts. Contemporary descriptions in county planning documents describe a modest but orderly structure, 3 stories tall, with dormitory floors above and administrative and communal spaces below. The grounds were enclosed, not with walls, but with a simple perimeter fence intended more to define property boundaries than to restrict movement. Photographs from the period, sparse but verifiable, show a building that would not have attracted attention had it not been associated with vulnerable populations. It was unremarkable by design. For nearly 2 decades, the institution operated without incident, at least as far as surviving documentation indicates. Annual inspection reports note predictable concerns about overcrowding during winter months and staffing shortages during harvest seasons, but nothing that would foreshadow abrupt closure. Then, in the spring of 1891, the tone of the records shifts. Supply orders are reduced rather than expanded. Maintenance requests are deferred. Staff wages are recorded as paid in lump sums rather than on regular schedules. A single marginal note in a ledger, written in a different hand than the surrounding entries, indicates that operations would be concluded by directive, though the directive itself is not attached, nor referenced elsewhere. This phrase appears nowhere else in the county archives from that decade. The final week of recorded activity is unusually detailed. Food inventories are counted down to exact quantities. Bedding is listed and accounted for. Even broken furniture is itemized. Yet there is no inventory of residents. In prior years, Such inventories were routine, often updated monthly. Here, at the moment when accuracy would matter most, the children vanish from the paperwork. When the building is formally closed, the deed transfer documents are filed promptly. Ownership shifts to a municipal holding entity, a common practice intended to preserve properties pending resale or repurposing. The closing inspection report notes that the building was secured, windows boarded, and doors locked. It does not mention personal effects, clothing, or any indication of recent habitation beyond what would be expected in an empty structure. There is no mention of abandoned belongings, no note of disorder, no sign of urgency. The closure reads as procedural, even calm. This is the first contradiction. Institutions caring for children rarely conclude operations without logistical disruption. Even well-planned closures generate correspondence, delays, complaints, and transitional records. None appear here. In the months that follow, the silence deepens. Newspaper archives from the region contain brief notices about the closure, framed as a cost-saving measure, but offer no details regarding the fate of the residents. Church records, which often track the movement of dependent children, show no corresponding influx. Neighboring institutions record no transfers. Census supplements from the following year list fewer children in care countywide than the previous year, not more. The numbers do not rebalance, they simply decrease. At this point, the simplest explanation would be that the children were quietly dispersed into households or relocated without formal documentation, a practice not unheard of during that period. But even informal placements left traces. Families sought stipends. Churches recorded baptisms. Schools registered new pupils. None of these secondary indicators appear in sufficient numbers to account for the missing residents. The administrative closure was thorough. The human accounting was absent. It was only after assembling these disparate records side by side that the pattern emerged clearly enough to resist dismissal. The institution closed, as if the children were no longer a factor requiring consideration. The paperwork treats their absence as settled before it is ever explained. And that raises the question that has remained unresolved since I first noticed that marginal note. What condition would allow an orphan house to close without releasing the children, without documenting their transfer, and without provoking inquiry at the time? That question cannot be answered yet, but it is the question that governs everything that follows. In order to determine whether this absence represented negligence, concealment, or something more systemic, I expanded the scope of my research beyond county ledgers and into adjacent record systems that would normally intersect with an institution of this type. Charitable facilities did not exist in isolation. They were embedded within networks of suppliers, inspectors, educators, clergy, and local officials, all of whom generated their own paper trails. When children moved, those trails usually overlapped. Here, they did not. I began with procurement records. The institution's food deliveries, which had been logged weekly for years, taper off sharply in the final month of operation. That tapering is important. It suggests advanced planning rather than sudden disruption. Orders are reduced incrementally, not canceled abruptly. Milk deliveries end first, followed by bread and preserved goods. Fresh produce deliveries stop last. This sequence implies a diminishing population, but without accompanying documentation explaining where that population went. Fuel records tell a similar story. Coal deliveries, essential for heating dormitories, are reduced in exact proportion to food supplies. The numbers align mathematically, as though someone calculated consumption requirements carefully. Yet no record explains the basis for those calculations. Staff payrolls provide another anomaly. Wages are issued as consolidated payments, and several employees are released simultaneously with letters of recommendation already prepared. These letters, preserved in unrelated collections, praise reliability and discretion, but make no mention of the circumstances under which employment ended. Discretion appears as a recurring theme, though it is never defined. Next, I examined school attendance registers. Children housed at the institution attended a local public school under a special designation. Their names appear consistently in attendance logs until late winter of 1891. Then they stop. There is no staggered withdrawal. The entries end collectively, midweek, without annotation. The teacher's log notes no illness outbreak, no weather closure, and no relocation notice. Attendance simply ceases. That absence would normally trigger inquiry, particularly given compulsory education laws recently enacted at the time. No inquiry is recorded. Church records offered no clarification. The institution maintained an affiliation with a nearby parish, which provided occasional services and recorded sacraments. Baptismal and burial registers from that year contain nothing corresponding to a large group of children, nor do they show an unusual increase in confirmations or transfers that might suggest dispersal to other congregations. The silence extends outward, consistent and comprehensive. I then turn to inspection reports. State inspectors visited charitable institutions annually, sometimes unannounced. The last inspection prior to closure describes conditions as acceptable if austere. The inspector notes that the children appeared orderly, quiet, and remarkably compliant, a phrase that stood out only after later discoveries. There is no recommendation for closure. The subsequent inspection, scheduled for the following year, is marked as unnecessary due to the cessation of operations. No follow-up is attached. The inspector's signature appears again elsewhere in the archive, but never in connection with this facility after that date. At this stage, the working explanations narrow. Either the children were relocated en masse through a process that left no surviving documentation, or the administrative system treated their disappearance as resolved without formal acknowledgement. Both possibilities require some mechanism of authority capable of suspending normal procedures without triggering resistance. To explore that mechanism, I examined correspondence between county officials during the months leading up to closure. Most letters concern budget allocations and maintenance issues, but one exchange stands apart. A brief letter from a regional administrator references the matter of continued responsibility and suggests that no further accounting will be required once the directive is enacted. The directive is never defined. The reply agrees, stating only that compliance will be ensured. The language is careful, almost evasive. It assumes shared understanding. There is no indication that the subject under discussion involves children at all. That omission is itself revealing. It implies that the status of the residents had already been conceptually separated from the institution's operational responsibilities. To see whether any contemporaneous public concern surfaced, I reviewed local newspapers beyond the initial closure notices. Editorials from that year focus on labor disputes, weather damage, and municipal debt. There are no letters to the editor questioning the fate of the children. No investigative pieces. No rumors preserved in print. This absence of public reaction suggests either widespread trust in the authorities involved or limited access to information about institutional operations. It may also indicate that whatever occurred did not present itself as a sudden or visible disruption to the community. The children were not seen leaving because no one was present to observe them. The institution's location, slightly removed from residential areas, would have limited casual observation. If departures occurred gradually or under controlled conditions, they could have escaped notice entirely. But gradual departures still generate paperwork. Controlled conditions still require records. What troubles me most is the consistency of the administrative behavior. Every system behaves as though the children are no longer within its jurisdiction. There is no confusion, no duplication of effort, and no contradictory documentation. The silence is coordinated. This coordination points toward an internal resolution that satisfied all participating entities without requiring external explanation. That resolution is invisible to us now because it was never intended to be examined later. At this point in the investigation, I began to suspect that the closure of the building was not the primary event, but the final administrative step following something already concluded. The directive mentioned in passing appears to be the key. It functioned as an endpoint, a signal that accounting obligations had been fulfilled by some prior action. The records do not show what that action was. They only show its administrative aftermath. To move closer to the truth, I needed to understand the physical state of the building at the moment it was closed. Structures retain traces of use and abandonment that paperwork cannot erase. Fortunately, there exists one description of the interior recorded shortly after closure, though it was not intended as an investigative document. It appears in a property assessment conducted for insurance purposes, a routine process triggered by the transfer of ownership. The assessor notes that the building was cleared and secured, with rooms empty of personal effects and furnishings arranged for storage. Dormitories contained no beds. The lockers were empty. The kitchen showed no signs of recent large-scale food preparation. This suggests that the children did not depart abruptly, leaving belongings behind. Their removal, whatever form it took, was methodical. Someone planned for absence. Someone ensured that nothing remained to suggest haste or distress. The building was prepared to be empty. That preparation implies foreknowledge, and foreknowledge implies intent. The insurance assessment would have been unremarkable if it had remained the only description of the building's interior, because it reads like the language of any property transaction: cleared, secured, orderly, prepared for vacancy. But a second set of materials exists, less formal, less polished, and therefore more revealing. These are not official reports. They are remnants that survived only because they were misplaced, filed under unrelated categories, or held privately by people who never intended to contribute to an investigation. In cases like this, the institutional record often fails precisely where the human record begins. The first artifact I found was a thin packet of receipts folded inside a ledger spine that had separated from its binding. They were not dramatic documents. They listed linen purchases, soap, a replacement lock, and a shipment of small metal tags used for inventory. The tags drew my attention because their quantities did not match any known inventory pattern for furniture or kitchen supplies. The numbers corresponded more closely to residents. Each tag was stamped with a single numeral, not a name, not an initial, a number. The receipt indicates delivery in late January of 1891, weeks before the closure was publicly announced. This suggests the institution was preparing to index something, to convert identities into a system that could be tracked without language. That alone would be unsettling, but not conclusive. Many institutions used numerical systems. What matters is what followed. Tucked behind the receipt was a single handwritten note on cheap paper, unsigned, containing only 2 lines. The first line listed 3 numbers. The second line contained a direction: store with the rest, not in the office. It reads like a reminder between staff members. But the instruction implies that there were items considered inappropriate for the office, items that belonged elsewhere, in a storage space separate from administrative oversight. This is a recurring pattern in institutional concealment. The official center remains clean, while the peripheral spaces hold what cannot be reconciled. I then located a maintenance log, the kind kept by caretakers who record repairs, leaks, broken hinges, and routine tasks. The final entries, dated in early February, list small jobs performed on interior doors and basement access points. One entry notes the replacement of a padlock on an interior stairwell. Another mentions boards installed to reduce draft in a corridor that was not described elsewhere. A draft is a benign explanation for boarding a space, but the language is careful. It does not say the corridor was closed. It does not say access was restricted. It says draft, practical, neutral. And yet the expenditure for the boards was unusually high, suggesting not a simple patch but a sustained barrier. It is difficult to overstate the importance of that kind of phrasing. When a record avoids naming the function of an action, it often means the function would raise questions. The most significant artifact emerged from a private collection I accessed only after tracing a family line through probate files. A former staff member, decades later, had left behind a small box of personal papers. These papers were ordinary: a pay stub, a letter of recommendation, a church bulletin, but beneath those items was a folded piece of stationery bearing a list of dates. Not many, perhaps 9 or 10. The dates spanned the final 6 weeks of operation. Beside each date was a single word. Not a description, not a name. A word that read like a procedural step. The sequence, translated into plain meaning, resembled scheduling for movement. The word suggested preparation, counting, and then a final term that I will not reproduce exactly because its ambiguity is part of its significance. It could mean transfer. It could mean release. It could mean removal. The handwriting was steady. The list was practical. It was not written as a confession. It was written as a plan. Yet there is no official document corresponding to that plan. The staff member who kept this list did not preserve it to reveal wrongdoing. The paper was folded and stored as though it were simply part of the job, something kept because it mattered at the time and then forgotten. That is what troubles me. The act implied by those words was normalized within the internal logic of the institution, even as the institution itself later behaved as though nothing happened. Having found these artifacts, I sought a human account, a statement from someone who had seen the children in the final days. Such accounts are rare, because children in institutional settings rarely left testimony that survived. They were not considered reliable narrators by adult systems. Their memories were not invited into record-keeping. But sometimes, in later life, fragments surface in unexpected forms. In this case, the fragment appears in an interview transcript housed in a regional historical society under a broader collection of oral histories about late 19th century civic life. The interview was conducted in the 1930s with an elderly woman recalling her childhood in the area. Most of her recollections are mundane: winter weather, farm chores, school routines. Then, without emphasis, she mentions the institution. She describes seeing children once, lined in pairs on the road near the building, escorted by adults she did not recognize. She says the children were dressed uniformly and carried nothing. She remembers the silence, not the silence of fear, she clarifies, but the silence of instruction, as though they had been told not to speak. The group moved toward town, then turned down a road leading away from public areas and toward the rail line. She does not know where they went. She says no one talked about it afterward. She was a child. She accepted what adults refused to explain. The interviewer did not follow up. The comment stands alone, a single paragraph in a much larger transcript. It might be dismissed as faulty memory, if not for one detail, she adds, a detail too precise to be ornamental. She says the adults guiding the children were wearing coats with identical patches on the sleeves, a symbol she could not identify but remembered because it looked like a simple geometric mark. That mark resembles, in a crude way, the seal used by a regional charitable oversight association whose records from that year are incomplete. It is not proof. It is alignment. And alignment matters when everything else has been erased. I then examined rail shipment logs for that period, not because I expected to find children listed as cargo, but because large group movements often generated ancillary paperwork, tickets, special carriage assignments, unusual scheduling. I found one entry in a station log that records an unscheduled stop by a private car attached to a freight line, authorized under a discretionary note by a regional official. The note does not list passengers. It lists only ward matter, a phrase sometimes used to refer to dependents under legal guardianship. The car stopped briefly, then continued east. Again, not proof, but another alignment with a timeline that otherwise shows no movement at all. At this stage, the case becomes harder to describe in conventional terms. The building was closed officially, but a separate process appears to have unfolded in the weeks before closure. A process that converted residents into numbers, secured interior spaces, reduced supplies in proportion to planned absence, and culminated in a movement that left no formal destination on paper. What remains unclear is whether this movement was legal whether it was disguised as legality or whether legality was simply treated as flexible when applied to those with no power to insist on documentation. The basement level does not appear in most summaries of the institution, which is consistent with how such spaces are treated in historical documentation. Basements are functional, not symbolic. They hold boilers, storage, laundry facilities, and maintenance corridors. They are rarely described unless something goes wrong. In this case, nothing officially went wrong there, which is precisely why the absence of detail becomes significant. To understand what role the lower level may have played, I examined the original architectural plans filed at the time of construction. These plans survive in fragmentary form, incomplete but legible enough to establish layout. The basement was larger than the footprint of the floors above, extending beneath areas that were later described as open yard. This expansion is not unusual in buildings of the period, but the configuration is. Instead of a single open utility space, the plans show a series of partitioned rooms connected by narrow corridors. Some are labeled generically: storage, laundry, furnace. Others are unlabeled entirely. No use is specified. That omission is not accidental. Architects labeled rooms when function mattered for inspection or compliance. An unlabeled space could be reassigned later without revision. It could be concealed in plain sight. The plans also show an exterior access point separate from the main entrance, reachable from the rear of the property by a service path that bypassed public roads. That path does not appear in later maps. It was either removed or deliberately excluded when the surrounding area was resurveyed after closure. I then located a set of maintenance invoices associated with basement equipment. These invoices include boiler servicing, drainage repairs, and one line item that stands out: installation of additional lighting in a corridor not listed in the official room directory. The lighting was installed in early February of 1891, at a time when the institution was already reducing operations elsewhere. Why improve lighting in a space that would soon be abandoned? Unless that space was not being abandoned at all. A caretaker's log from the same period contains a brief note about extended use below, with no explanation. Extended use of what and by whom is left unstated. Caretaker logs are pragmatic documents. They record effort because effort costs time. If a space required attention, it meant someone was there. Someone needed light. Someone needed heat. Someone needed access. I also examined municipal water usage records. These are rarely consulted in historical investigations, but they can be revealing. Water consumption at the institution declined overall as food deliveries tapered off, but not evenly. Usage associated with upper floors dropped first. Basement usage remained steady longer, then declined abruptly only days before the building was formally closed. That pattern suggests activity relocated downward before ending. It also suggests that whatever occurred there did not leave immediately with the rest of the population. Something persisted below ground until very near the end. There is one more document that complicates this picture further. It is a fire inspection note, not a full report, conducted as part of a routine sweep of public buildings. The inspector lists exits, stairwells, and hazards. In the basement section, he notes that one interior door was secured beyond standard. That phrasing is unusual. Inspectors normally specify locks, bars, or obstructions. Beyond standard implies deviation from code without elaboration. The inspector did not flag it as a violation. He simply recorded it. The implication is that he either accepted an explanation he did not write down or chose not to pursue the matter. That choice matters. It suggests that the security of that space was understood as intentional and authorized. Authorized by whom is not stated. To understand what might have been stored or conducted below ground, I searched for inventory lists that included basement contents. None survive. Instead, there is a reference in a disposal record dated shortly after closure. The record lists items removed from the building prior to sale: desks, beds, and kitchen equipment. Basement contents are summarized as Cleared per instruction. There is no itemization. There is no destination listed. Clearing implies removal. Per instruction implies a directive. Again, the directive remains unnamed. I want to be clear about what this does and does not suggest. There is no evidence of violence in the basement. There are no records of confinement in the sense that the term is often sensationalized. What the evidence suggests instead is process. A controlled, administrative process that required space, privacy, and separation from public areas. A process that benefited from reduced visibility. A process that concluded before formal closure, leaving the building empty and ready to be transferred without explanation. The absence of beds and personal belongings upstairs aligns with the idea that the children did not simply vanish overnight. They were prepared to leave. Their environment was systematically stripped of traces. Downstairs, however, activity lingered longer, suggesting a final phase that did not align neatly with public-facing timelines. When institutions operate at the edges of legality or morality, they often do so by reclassifying people into categories that require less documentation. Wards, dependents, units, numbers. Once reclassified, movement can occur under different rules. That reclassification appears to have happened here, quietly, efficiently, and without record. The basement becomes significant not as a site of spectacle, but as the physical manifestation of administrative transition. It is where normal categories were suspended and replaced with something more abstract, something easier to move without acknowledgement. The legal frameworks governing institutions of this kind in the late 19th century were simultaneously rigid and porous. On paper, responsibility for dependents followed defined channels. In practice, those channels could be redirected through discretionary authority, especially when the dependents in question lacked advocates capable of challenging procedural shifts. To understand how the disappearance of an entire population could resolve without contradiction, I examined the statutes in effect at the time, not to find loopholes in the modern sense, but to understand how authority was distributed and how accountability could be diffused across multiple offices without any single one bearing the full weight of explanation. The institution operated under a charter that granted broad autonomy in matters of internal management while remaining subject to periodic oversight. That oversight, however, was contingent upon continued operation. Once the decision to cease operations was made, oversight obligations diminished rapidly. The charter allowed for wards to be transferred to appropriate care without specifying documentation standards beyond internal record-keeping. In other words, the law assumed good faith. It did not require proof of outcome, only assertion of intent. That assumption is critical. It means that once an internal decision was reached and affirmed by the appropriate authority, the external system accepted the result without requiring verification. I then traced the chain of guardianship responsibility. Legally, the institution acted in loco parentis, assuming temporary guardianship of the children. Upon closure, that guardianship could be reassigned to other entities with equivalent authority. Those entities included regional boards, private placements, and state-supervised arrangements. Each reassignment dissolved the previous obligation. Responsibility moved, but accountability did not accumulate. It dispersed. The records reflect this dispersion. There is a brief entry in a regional board's minutes noting that dependent matters formerly administered by the facility have been resolved. Resolved is the operative word. It does not describe where, how, or under what conditions. It describes only an administrative state. Once resolved, the matter no longer required discussion. I looked for placement contracts, adoption records, apprenticeship agreements, anything that would normally accompany the reassignment of children during that period. None appear. That absence is often explained by loss or destruction of records, but here the pattern suggests something else. The transfers may not have been individual. They may have been collective. Collective transfers were treated differently. When dependents were moved as a group under a single authority, Individual documentation was often considered redundant. The group itself became the unit of record. That is consistent with the numerical tagging system suggested by the receipts I described earlier. Numbers allow grouping. Names resist it. I also examined court dockets for cases involving the institution or its wards. There are none after the closure date. This is notable because institutional closures often generated disputes, unpaid wages, contested guardianship, and property claims. Here, nothing. The silence suggests that all parties withstanding either consented to the resolution or lacked the capacity to contest it. Consent does not imply understanding. It implies compliance. To see whether any oversight body questioned the outcome, I reviewed legislative committee reports from the following year. One report mentions a reduction in dependent population statewide, attributing it to successful reallocation efforts. No details are provided. No facilities are named. The language is congratulatory. It frames absence as success. That framing matters. It transforms disappearance into achievement. The system congratulates itself for efficiency, not for outcomes. At this point, the legal picture clarifies. The children did not vanish into a void. They were absorbed into a system that did not require their individual futures to be recorded. Once absorbed, their existence ceased to be legible within public archives. This is not a failure of law. It is an expression of how law prioritized administrative resolution over human continuity. The institution's closure marks the end of one ledger. The absence of subsequent records marks the beginning of another that we cannot access. What remains is a residue of inconsistency, moments where the administrative narrative and the physical evidence do not align perfectly. Those moments are not enough to reconstruct individual lives, but they are enough to challenge the notion that nothing happened. Something happened, it was authorized, it was processed, it was completed. And it left no place for those affected to re-enter the historical record as subjects rather than categories. There is one final legal artifact worth noting before we move forward. A marginal note in a county register, added years later by a clerk reviewing old files, reads simply, "Status unclear prior to consolidation." The consolidation refers to a later administrative merger unrelated to the institution itself. But the clerk's note acknowledges uncertainty. It acknowledges that even within the system, the resolution was incomplete in a way that could not be corrected retroactively. That acknowledgement is rare. It suggests that someone, at some point, noticed the gap. Not enough to reopen it, just enough to mark it. In the decades that followed the closure, the site entered a phase that is often overlooked in historical analysis because it appears uneventful. There were no scandals attached to it, no redevelopment controversies, and no dramatic rediscoveries. That absence of activity is itself the pattern. Places associated with unresolved administrative actions are frequently handled through passive strategies. They are not demolished immediately. They are not repurposed quickly. They are allowed to recede. The institution remained standing for years, its presence acknowledged only through occasional references in property records and maintenance notes that grew increasingly vague over time. Ownership was transferred to a holding trust created for the explicit purpose of managing defunct properties. Such trusts were common. They existed to absorb liability without generating attention. The trust maintained the grounds minimally, ensuring the building did not collapse or become a hazard, but it did not invest in repairs or improvements. The building was neither alive nor dead in administrative terms. It occupied a suspended state. Local maps from the early 20th century include the structure but remove its name. It is marked simply as a large building. Later maps remove it entirely, replacing the footprint with open space. This cartographic erasure parallels the administrative erasure that preceded it. When something becomes difficult to categorize, systems often resolve the difficulty by omitting it. I examined zoning and land use records to see whether any attempts were made to repurpose the site. There were proposals. One involved converting the building into agricultural storage. Another suggested leasing the land for seasonal use. None progressed beyond preliminary discussion. The reasons given are practical: cost, access, and lack of demand. But correspondence between trust administrators hints at something else. One letter mentions that continued vacancy is preferable to unintended attention. Attention to what is not specified. It does not need to be. The implication is that activity itself would invite questions. Better to leave the building inert. Oral histories from nearby residents reflect this inertia. People knew the building existed. They knew it had once housed children. They did not know what happened to those children. They did not speculate openly. When asked, they described the place as closed, finished, and no longer relevant. Children were warned away from it, not with stories of danger, but with reminders that it was private property and that nothing remained there worth seeing. This kind of discouragement is effective because it frames curiosity as pointless rather than forbidden. Over time, the structure decayed. Windows were boarded, roof sections sagged, vegetation reclaimed the grounds. Photographs from the mid-20th century show a building that appears abandoned in the ordinary sense, indistinguishable from many other neglected structures of its era. What those photographs do not show is evidence of forced closure or emergency. There are no broken doors, no scattered belongings, no signs of haste. The decay is gradual, consistent with a place that was prepared to be empty. That preparation is crucial. It means that even as the physical structure deteriorated, the narrative surrounding it remained controlled. There was nothing visible to provoke inquiry. Eventually, the building was demolished. The demolition permit lists the structure as obsolete and unsafe. No mention is made of its prior function. The debris was removed. The land was leveled. A small marker was installed years later, noting the existence of a former charitable facility without dates, without explanation. That marker satisfies the requirement of acknowledgement without inviting investigation. It marks presence without meaning. I want to pause here to emphasize something. The absence of dramatic aftermath does not indicate benign resolution. It indicates successful absorption. Systems that handle uncomfortable outcomes often aim not to erase them completely, but to normalize them into invisibility. The site becomes just another parcel of land. The story becomes just another footnote. The people involved become indistinguishable from statistics. This is how unresolved histories persist without friction. They do not provoke outrage because they do not announce themselves. They simply fade. And yet, traces remain. In the 1970s, during a regional survey of historical sites, an archivist noted discrepancies between the recorded population capacity of the institution and the documented dependent population in subsequent years. The discrepancy was not large enough to warrant investigation. It was explained away as migration or record-keeping error. That explanation was accepted. Later, a graduate thesis examining child welfare trends referenced a sudden drop in institutional populations statewide during the same period. The author attributed it to reform and decentralization. Again, a plausible explanation. Again, accepted. What these analyses miss is specificity. They treat populations as fluid and interchangeable. They do not ask where specific groups went. They assume movement equates to improvement. That assumption is built into the language of reform itself. When I revisited the site years later, there was nothing to see. Grass, trees, a fence line marking private land. The absence was complete. And yet, standing there, with the accumulated documentation in mind, the place felt crowded with implications. Not ghosts, not mysteries in the sensational sense, implications. Decisions made without witnesses. Processes executed without records. Lives redirected without narrative. The long-term aftermath of the institution's closure is not a story of concealment through destruction, but of concealment through normalcy. The building was allowed to become ordinary, then absent. The story was allowed to become administrative, then irrelevant. That is why the case persists only in fragments. It was designed to. The fragments that survive after an event like this are rarely definitive. They do not offer names neatly traced across decades or lives that can be reconstructed from beginning to end. What they offer instead are faint points of contact, moments where an individual briefly re-enters the archival field before disappearing again. These moments are not enough to tell us who someone became. They are enough to show that disappearance was not theoretical. It happened to specific people, even if the system refused to preserve their specificity. I approached this phase of the investigation cautiously, aware that the temptation to overinterpret sparse data can distort rather than clarify. My aim was not recovery in the sentimental sense, but pattern recognition. I began with census anomalies. The census conducted in 1890, the one immediately preceding the closure, lists a dependent population consistent with the institution's capacity. The next census, 10 years later, shows a reduction in dependent counts in the surrounding districts that exceeds what migration alone would explain. The excess reduction is not dramatic. It is small enough to be dismissed as an error. But when mapped geographically, it aligns with areas serviced by the same oversight bodies involved in the institution's closure. That alignment suggests redistribution rather than disappearance in the literal sense. The children did not cease to exist. They ceased to be legible as a group. I then examined apprenticeship records, which often served as informal placement mechanisms during this period. These records are incomplete by nature, but a subset survives in county courthouses and trade association archives. Within those records, I found entries that list wards without prior local residency, assigned in clusters to the same industries within a narrow time frame. The clusters are important. Apprenticeships were typically individualized. Clustering implies coordinated placement. The ages listed are approximate. Names are common. There is no direct reference to the institution. But the timing overlaps precisely with the months following closure. This suggests that some of the children were absorbed into labor systems under new classifications. Once classified as apprentices, they exited the category of dependents. Their previous status no longer required acknowledgement. I also reviewed admission records from other institutions in the region. A few show spikes in intake shortly after the closure. The spikes are noted, but not explained. Administrators attribute them to increased need. They do not reference source institutions. Again, plausible but incomplete. The children may have been redistributed across multiple facilities, each receiving a small number, small enough to avoid scrutiny. This would align with the absence of mass transfer records. Large movements attract attention. Small ones dissolve into background noise. There is one particularly unsettling fragment I want to address carefully. It appears in a death register from several years later, listing a young adult whose place of birth is unknown and whose guardianship history is marked simply as institutional. The cause of death is ordinary. The notation that follows is not. It states that no next of kin could be identified and that burial was arranged under standard provisions. This is not unusual. What is unusual is the accompanying marginal mark, a small symbol used by clerks to indicate prior state involvement. That symbol appears infrequently. When it does, it usually corresponds to individuals who passed through multiple systems without permanent attachment. The symbol does not tell us who this person was. It tells us that their history was already fragmented before their death. They entered adulthood without narrative continuity. They exited it the same way. I found 3 such entries over a span of 15 years, all sharing similar characteristics. None can be conclusively linked to the institution, but the pattern is consistent with what happens when children are redistributed without long-term tracking. They become administratively free, but socially unanchored. Their lives proceed without accumulation of record density. They remain thinly documented. This thinness is the legacy of the closure. It is not evidence of harm in itself. It is evidence of neglect at the level of identity. To be untracked is not the same as being abused, but it is a vulnerability. It means there is no system responsible for remembering you. I also examined immigration and relocation records, not because I believed the children were moved internationally, but because such records often capture internal movements mislabeled as external. I found nothing conclusive. That absence reinforces the idea that redistribution occurred within accepted domestic channels, channels that did not require centralized documentation. Each child's movement was legal. Collectively, their disappearance was invisible. What emerges from these fragments is not a hidden atrocity, but a quiet one. A procedural dissolution of identity that left no single act to condemn and no single authority to confront. The children became individuals without pasts, at least as far as the record is concerned. That is why their fate feels unresolved. Not because something unspeakable happened, but because something ordinary happened under conditions that stripped it of traceability. When examined as a whole, the case resists the narrative structures we are accustomed to using. There is no singular moment of rupture, no event that can be isolated as the cause of everything that followed. Instead, there is a sequence of actions that individually appear reasonable, lawful, and even well-intentioned. It is only when those actions are viewed collectively that their cumulative effect becomes troubling. This is the difficulty of interpreting systems rather than incidents. Systems rarely announce themselves as harmful. They operate through procedure, repetition, and delegation. Responsibility is shared until it becomes unlocatable. What happened here is not hidden in a single document or decision. It is distributed across many, each one insufficient on its own to raise alarm. The institution closed, the children were reassigned, records were adjusted, oversight concluded. Each step followed established norms, and yet the outcome is a historical void. This void forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. When does lawful process become moral erasure? The children were not forgotten accidentally. They were forgotten systematically. Their identities were not destroyed. They were rendered unnecessary to preserve. The system did not need to remember them once their administrative function ended. That is the core pattern this case exposes. It is not about secrecy. It is about sufficiency. The system had enough information to complete its tasks. It did not require more. The absence of additional records is not a failure. It is a feature. This perspective reframes the meaning of the fragments we have examined. The numerical tags, the group transfers, the consolidated payrolls, the undefined directives. These are not signs of chaos. They are signs of efficiency. They show a system optimizing for closure, not continuity. Efficiency becomes the guiding principle. Continuity becomes optional. This is why later inquiries falter. We look for intent where there is only process. We look for villains where there are only clerks. The harm, if we can call it that, does not originate from malice. It originates from design choices embedded in administrative culture. Those choices determine what must be recorded and what may be discarded. In this case, individual histories fell into the discard category. That realization complicates any attempt to resolve the story emotionally. There is no revelation that restores dignity or justice retroactively. There is only recognition of how easily systems can erase without violence, without overt cruelty, without even awareness that erasure is occurring. The children's disappearance is unsettling, precisely because it is unremarkable in procedural terms. It follows the logic of the era's institutional frameworks. Those frameworks were built to manage populations, not narratives. They succeeded. The absence we encounter now is the residue of that success. I have considered whether this case should be understood as an outlier or as a representative example of a broader pattern. The evidence suggests the latter. Similar closures occurred elsewhere. Similar administrative resolutions appear in other records. What distinguishes this case is not what happened, but how cleanly it happened. The documentation aligns too well. The silence is too consistent. It offers a rare opportunity to observe a system functioning exactly as intended and to question the values embedded in that function. This leads to a final layer of interpretation. The orphan house was not closed without releasing the children in the literal sense. The children were released from one category into another. They were released from visibility. They were released from the obligation of remembrance. That release was complete. It did not require secrecy. It required only consensus about what mattered. The building's closure marked the end of an administrative problem. The children's subsequent lives were no longer part of that problem. They became someone else's responsibility, or no one's. From the system's perspective, the matter was resolved. From ours, it remains unresolved because we value continuity differently. We want stories that follow through. We want names that persist. We want endings that feel proportional to beginnings. The system did not share those priorities. This difference in values is what creates the lingering unease. Not the idea that something monstrous occurred, but the realization that nothing monstrous was required. The persistence of unease in cases like this does not come from unanswered questions alone. It comes from answers that feel structurally complete but morally insufficient. By the time the last administrative action is recorded, the system has done everything it was designed to do. The files are closed, the obligations are met, the institution ceases to exist. What remains unresolved exists outside the framework that produced the records in the first place. This creates a tension between historical method and human expectation. As researchers, we are trained to accept documentation as evidence of completion. As observers, we struggle with the implications of that completion when it results in absence rather than clarity. The orphan house becomes a focal point for this tension because it occupies a space where care and control overlap. Institutions established for protection also function as mechanisms of categorization. Children are admitted, classified, maintained, and eventually discharged according to criteria that are rarely questioned once codified. When such an institution closes, the process reverses. The population is redistributed. The structure dissolves. What is rarely accounted for is the continuity of identity across that transition. The system tracks movement, not meaning. It records transfers, not experiences. This is why later generations encounter difficulty reconstructing what happened. We are attempting to extract narrative coherence from records that were never intended to preserve narrative. They were intended to ensure compliance. The discomfort we feel is a response to that mismatch. We expect archives to hold stories. In many cases, they hold only proof that procedures were followed. This case forces us to confront the limits of archival truth. The absence of names after a certain point is not an error to be corrected through further digging. It is the endpoint of the system's concern. Once the children cross the threshold from institutional wards to administrative units transferred elsewhere, their identities cease to be relevant to the originating institution. No mechanism existed to ensure longitudinal tracking. No requirement compelled follow-up. That omission was not accidental. It reflected prevailing assumptions about responsibility. Care was location-based. Once the location changed, care obligations shifted with it. Memory did not travel alongside. This is why attempts to locate descendants or later references yield so little. The system did not create a trail designed to be followed. It created a trail designed to end. Understanding this changes how we interpret the remaining artifacts. The marginal notes that appear ambiguous are not clues in the traditional sense. They are boundary markers. They indicate where responsibility stops. The lack of detail is not concealment. It is a delegation. Someone else would now be responsible, somewhere else, under a different set of records. Whether that transfer occurred smoothly or disastrously is unknowable from this vantage point. The originating institution no longer tracked outcomes. Its task was complete. This raises a broader issue about how we evaluate historical accountability. Modern frameworks often assume continuity of oversight. We expect that institutions hand off information comprehensively. In the late 19th century, such continuity was rare. Jurisdictional boundaries fragmented responsibility. Paper traveled slowly. Records were local. Once a child left a facility, they effectively entered a new documentary universe. Unless that universe intersected with future legal, medical, or criminal processes, their existence might never be recorded again. This is not because they vanished physically. It is because they fell below the threshold of documentation. The unsettling nature of the case lies in that threshold. It demonstrates how easily lives can pass beneath it. There is also a psychological component to our reaction. Orphan houses occupy a charged, symbolic space. They represent society's acknowledgement of vulnerability and its obligation to respond. When such a place closes, we instinctively look for reassurance that the obligation was fulfilled elsewhere. The records provide procedural reassurance, but withhold emotional confirmation. They tell us that something was done, but not that it was sufficient. This gap invites speculation, but speculation is not necessary to feel disturbed. The disturbance comes from recognizing how narrow the criteria for sufficiency were. The system required proof of transfer, not proof of well-being. It required signatures, not outcomes. It required closure, not care, continuity. In this sense, the orphan house was not an anomaly. It was an expression of institutional logic applied without interruption. The children's later invisibility is the natural consequence of that logic. This understanding reframes how we interpret silence in historical records. Silence is often treated as a puzzle to solve. In some cases, it is a solution that was intentionally implemented, not to hide wrongdoing, but to streamline responsibility. This distinction matters because it challenges the assumption that all historical mysteries conceal dramatic truths. Some conceal banal ones. The truth here may be that nothing extraordinary happened at all. Children were transferred, records were filed, lives continued elsewhere, and yet that possibility does not alleviate discomfort. It intensifies it. If nothing extraordinary happened, then this pattern could have occurred repeatedly without notice. The case becomes less about a singular institution and more about an entire system's capacity to lose people without intent or malice. That is harder to confront than deliberate wrongdoing. It implicates structures rather than individuals. It leaves no one to blame and nothing to resolve. This is why the story persists despite its lack of spectacle. It confronts us with the fragility of historical presence. Being recorded is not guaranteed. Being remembered is conditional. It depends on remaining within the scope of systems designed to notice you. Once outside that scope, existence continues without trace. The orphan house stands as a reminder of how narrow that scope can be. What ultimately endures in cases like this is not resolution, but orientation. We do not emerge with answers so much as with a recalibrated sense of what questions are appropriate to ask. The orphan house, once closed, did not generate scandal, litigation, or reform. It faded from administrative concern with remarkable efficiency. The absence of controversy is itself instructive. It reveals how fully the closure aligned with accepted practices of the period. Nothing in the records suggests panic, disagreement, or hesitation. The process unfolded according to plan. That plan, however, was built around assumptions that no longer sit comfortably with us. The idea that children could be relocated en masse without durable identifiers, that their subsequent lives did not warrant tracking by the institution that had governed their earliest years, reflects a framework in which care was bounded by jurisdiction rather than continuity. To modern sensibilities, this feels incomplete. To the system that produced the records, it was sufficient. This divergence is where the story's weight accumulates. It asks us to sit with the difference between sufficiency and adequacy. The documents demonstrate sufficiency beyond dispute. They do not demonstrate adequacy in any human sense we recognize today. This gap is not an invitation to project catastrophe. It is an invitation to acknowledge how easily adequacy can be defined downward when systems prioritize closure over care. The orphan house did not fail by its own standards. It succeeded. That success is what troubles us. It suggests that harm does not always arise from deviation or neglect. It can arise from compliance, from the smooth execution of procedures that were never designed to preserve individual continuity. The children were not erased in a dramatic sense. They were processed out of relevance. This distinction matters because it reframes our understanding of historical loss. Loss is not always violent or abrupt. It can be incremental and administrative. It can occur through perfectly legal actions carried out by conscientious officials. The disappearance that unsettles us is not a disappearance of bodies, but of narratives. The children do not reappear because the system did not require them to. Their future selves were not the institution's responsibility. Once transferred, they became someone else's concern, and that someone else may not have been obligated to record anything further. This creates a cascading absence that no single archive can correct. Each repository holds a fragment. None hold the whole. As researchers, we are tempted to believe that enough fragments will eventually assemble into a complete picture. This case resists that belief. The fragments do not interlock. They terminate. They point outward and then dissolve. That dissolution is not a failure of research. It is the object of study. The orphan house becomes a lens through which to examine how systems decide when a story ends. The ending here is procedural. It is marked by stamps, signatures, and dates written in careful hands. After that, the story does not continue. It disperses. The children's lives likely unfolded in ordinary ways. Some may have prospered, some may not have. The point is not their outcomes. The point is that those outcomes were never bound to the originating institution's memory. That memory was finite by design. This realization carries an ethical implication. When we study the past, we often look for moments of rupture, of crisis that expose wrongdoing. We are less practiced at recognizing the harm embedded in normal operations. This case suggests that attention itself is a moral act. To notice where records end is to confront the values that shape them. To ask why continuity was not preserved is to question the priorities of systems that defined care narrowly. The orphan house was built to shelter, to organize, to manage. It was not built to remember beyond its walls. That limitation is not unique to this institution. It is characteristic of an era and, in many respects, of bureaucratic systems more broadly. The discomfort we feel is a measure of how our expectations have shifted. We now expect institutions that intervene in early life to retain some obligation to future well-being. The absence of that obligation in the records forces us to acknowledge that this expectation is relatively recent. It also forces us to consider where similar gaps may persist today, less visible because they are normalized. The story does not end with condemnation or mystery. It ends with a recognition of fragility. Lives can pass through systems designed to help them and emerge untraceable without any explicit wrongdoing. The archive will show that everything was done correctly. That correctness will not satisfy us. It should not. The purpose of examining cases like this is not to retrofit blame but to sharpen awareness, to recognize how easily human continuity can be lost when responsibility is partitioned too finely. The orphan house stands as a quiet marker of that loss. Not a place of horror, but of administrative finality. Its closure was orderly. Its silence afterward was complete. What remains is not a secret waiting to be uncovered, but a lesson waiting to be acknowledged. That some forms of disappearance are built into the systems we trust, and that remembering them requires intentional effort long after the paperwork is finished. If this kind of investigation matters to you, if you believe that examining the edges of the historical record helps us understand not just what happened, but how systems shape lives, then consider subscribing. These stories persist only if they are revisited, and attention is the only form of preservation that outlasts the archive.